For over a decade in the mid-20th century, there was hardly a man in America quite as famous as Jimmy Hoffa. James Riddle Hoffa was the president of the largest trucking union in America from 1957 to 1971, known as International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In a society where trucks are the primary means of transporting goods, it was vital that the rights of these truckers be protected. This union had many chapters throughout America, and by 1968 had accrued 2 million members. However, when most people think of Jimmy Hoffa today, they think of his criminal activity, his connections to the Italian mafia in America, and how in 1975 he mysteriously disappeared without a trace. It is a story that has baffled people for nearly 50 years. No body was ever recovered, and everyone with connections to Jimmy Hoffa remained silent. All except maybe one. Frank Sheeran was a Teamsters member and a personal bodyguard to Jimmy Hoffa for many years. In addition to this, he was also a known enforcer for the Buffalino crime family. For decades, he acted as a blunt instrument for the mob, carrying out various orders on their behalf, including murder. And being an associate of Hoffa's, he was of course brought in for questioning, but said nothing. That is until 1991 when, while in prison, Frank talked to former homicide investigator and criminal prosecutor Charles Brandt. After this first meeting, Brandt spent the next 5 years interviewing Frank. And it is the confessions Frank gave him that Brandt would use to write the best-selling true crime novel, I Heard You Paint Houses, which is the inspiration for the real topic of today's video, The Irishman. I never turned the light on behind me, hang on. There we go. That's better. The Irishman was directed by Martin Scorsese and produced by Netflix, being released in 2019. And much like the book, this film follows the life of Frank Sheeran as described to Charles Brandt in his interview. The Irishman was Frank's nickname in the mob. Being of Irish descent, he couldn't be officially a made man. That title was reserved only for Italian mob members. Nevertheless, Frank was still able to rise through the ranks, as we will see in a moment. This film is 3.5 hours long. It is the longest film of Scorsese's career, including the much more recent Killers of the Flower Moon. It is also the longest film to have been released in the last 20 years. In other words, we have a lot to get through. I hope I'm in frame this time. The last video I did, the Dune video, my head was cut off. I hope I've fixed that now. The Irishman mainly focuses on Frank's relationship with the Buffalino crime family and, of course, Jimmy Hoffa. And to me, this movie is very unique. It is widely known, I think, that Netflix originals are not known for being the best. And yet, when they partnered with Scorsese, the king of the gangster movie, they managed to make what is, in my opinion, the greatest mafia movie ever made. And that does include The Godfather, for all of you cinema nerds who are gonna be mad at me for saying that. I do love The Godfather, though. It has everything that I think makes Scorsese movies so great, as well as several other elements that we will talk about throughout the course of this video. Today we will be going over the story of the film and the rich, real history behind it. And in doing so, we will witness Frank Sheeran's confession and his story on what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. And before we get into the story, I just want to put just a massive disclaimer here right now. This story stems from the account of a known mobster. While some of the stories in this film are verifiably true, others are not. There are examples of events in the film where the people responsible cannot be proven, and so a lot of the stuff we are going to talk about is steeped in allegedlys and hearsay. We'll talk about those more as we go along, but I just wanted to establish that here and now. Hey everyone, it's your boy, editor Chris, the Chris that is editing the video that you're watching right now, and I'm here with another disclaimer. So something happened during the recording process of this video that has never happened to me before. So when I'm recording these videos, I use a variety of filters to make my microphone sound a little bit better, and one of those filters is a noise gate, which for those of you who don't know, a noise gate essentially acts as a bubble around your microphone. And so if there's ever a background noise, whether that's like a furnace or people talking in another room that's registering in the microphone but it's really quiet, the noise gate will take that audio down to 0 so that all you can hear is me talking into the microphone. But I don't know what happened when I recorded this video, whether it was the fact that maybe I spoke quieter than I normally do or not, but for whatever reason, certain words, or in some cases entire phrases that I would say, were chunked out of the video. Like every so often the audio will just cut out, and so you'll miss entire words that I said. You've probably noticed a couple examples up until this point where I said a word but it kind of sounded weird compared to the rest of the sentence. And that's because I have decided to retroactively voice over in those words and phrases in order to save this video, because I recorded this video for like 3 hours, over 3 hours, and so I was not gonna re-record the whole video. So from here on out, whenever you hear a phrase and it doesn't quite match up with how I was saying it in the original recording, you'll know that it's me sitting here at my desk recording that audio. Thank you so much for your patience, and we are going to get back to the video. Thank you so much for bearing with me. And so with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and let's get into it. The timeline of The Irishman cuts back and forth between various timelines, so here is just a brief explanation on the rough timeline of The Irishman. I'm going to attempt to hold the whiteboard up to the camera. I don't know if you'll be able to see all of it. This is the timeline of The Irishman. I've made another diagram. Are you proud of me? The events of the film are being recalled by Frank Sheeran somewhere between the years 1998 and 2003. That's at the opposite end of the board. This timeline is primarily voiceover narration, so whenever you hear Frank voicing over events in the film, it is that Frank that is doing that. However, we do occasionally cut to him in this time period as well. And then there is the year 1975. This timeline consists of a road trip to Detroit for a wedding. And on the way, Frank recalls events in his life that led him to this moment. So you can see the dotted line arrows of the future Frank looking back at 1975, and then the 1975 Frank looking back at past events. 1975 is also conveniently the year that Jimmy Hoffa went missing, so I'm sure something interesting is going to happen there. These events he's reflecting on begin in 1955 and work their way up to 1975, so that's the solid arrow leading away from it. There's also a brief flashback to something that happened between 1943 and 1945, so that's kind of the offshoot of the timeline, but that's only one instance. And then once the timeline arrives at 1975, we then witness the events that lead from 1975 to the present, somewhere in between 1998 and 2003. And so that's how the timeline works. So whenever I say we're cutting to a different time period, you know what's going on. I hope you can see that. I genuinely don't know if you can see that. I'd get a monitor to strap onto my camera, but the HDMI on my camera is broken. I'm not complaining. This is a really nice camera, and I'm lucky to have it even though it has that fault. And so we begin the story of The Irishman somewhere in between 1998 and 2003 in a nursing home. Nurses go from room to room checking on the patients who are either sitting in their rooms, watching television, or playing games in the lounge. The camera travels up a long hallway and into the lounge of this place. And there we come upon someone who appears to be an unassuming elderly man, staring blankly forward ahead of him. He's sitting in a wheelchair with a cane resting lightly in his hand. However, something that stands out about this man are two large pieces of jewelry. There is a golden watch and a large golden ring. This, of course, is Frank Sheeran, a powerful mobster who is at the end of his life, who is played, of course, by Robert De Niro. He remains silent for a moment, but then begins to speak. He talks about how when he was a kid, he used to believe that house painters genuinely did paint houses. In the mafia, house painter is code for a hitman. And now that he is an adult, he has lost that naivete. This, as I've said, is the narration timeline. So whenever we hear Frank speaking in voiceover, this is the Frank that is speaking. I believe he is telling his story here in the care home to Charles Brandt. In real life, this confession was made in prison, but I believe that for the sake of the narrative, Scorsese has this dialogue take place here in the nursing home. Additionally, this also gives the audience the impression that Frank is talking directly to them, which is really cool. And so Frank recalls back in the day when he was just a truck driver and a union member of Local 107 in Philadelphia.
And then I started painting houses myself.
We then see a quick shot of a gun being leveled at the back of someone's head. Blood splatters on the wall behind him. We are then immediately shown a wedding invitation. The groom doesn't really matter, but the bride is the daughter of Bill Buffalino, an attorney for the Teamsters and cousin to Russell Buffalino, who we'll talk about later. Actually, fun fact, Bill is called Russell's cousin, but the two aren't actually related. Russell allowed Bill to use the name Buffalino to his own advantage in life. They shared a last name, but they were not related. But Russell just kind of allowed people to assume that they were. And the wedding of Bill's daughter takes place in 1975, where we see a slightly younger Frank Sheeran getting ready for the day, including putting on his gold watch and ring. The wedding is in Detroit, and he's driving Russell and their two wives up there from Philly. And on the way they would make stops so that Russell, who is played by Joe Pesci, could collect money from the various businesses along the way that are in his pocket. Which, fun fact, prior to this, Joe Pesci had not acted on screen in a feature-length film since 2010. In 1999, he semi-retired from acting in order to focus on a music career and also just enjoy life. It has been stated that he turned the role down several times before finally accepting, and I am glad he did. I also never knew this as a kid because the only thing I knew him from was Home Alone and Home Alone 2 Lost in New York. But Joe Pesci is just genuinely like a really talented Academy Award winning actor. I don't know, that just caught me off guard when I watched The Irishman for the first time because that was the only thing aside from the two Home Alone movies that I'd ever seen him in. And so Frank, Russell, and both of their wives take to the road. The dialogue in the car, as well as the dialogue in many scenes, just feels so natural. I can't really describe it, but it feels improvised, but also so in character. It doesn't feel like I'm watching actors acting, it just feels like I'm watching like a home video. It's a simple conversation. Russell's wife wants to have a smoke, but Russell forbids anyone from smoking around him. Just the way that it's delivered feels so real, like a slice of life.
Can we stop soon?
We're only in the car 2 minutes, honey. We're not even near the highway.
And so they stop on the highway so that the wives can get out and smoke. And as they wait, Frank points out to Russell where they are. Just across the street from them on the highway is an old Texaco gas station, one that the two recognize all too well. And then suddenly we cut to a much younger Frank in the year 1955, back in his days as a truck driver. And as he drives along the highway, the engine begins to seize and stall, forcing him to park in a Texaco gas station. Frank opens the engine, but he has no experience with engine repair, and so he's kind of just like staring at the engine waiting for it to work. And as he looks, a man comes by and asks him if he needs some help.
I don't know. It sounds funny. It stops, it starts, it loses power.
See if I can give you a hand.
This man immediately identifies the issue and is able to fix it up for Frank no problem.
Timing chain. This is what this is. There's a cap on it. This cap is loose and ain't supposed to be loose.
Frank introduces himself to the man, but the man doesn't give his name. All he asks is where Frank is from and where he likes to hang out in Philly. Recalling this encounter in the nursing home, Frank had assumed at the time that this person owned something, because he had this air of authority around him where you just knew he owned something. But as it turns out, he didn't own the station, he owned the entire road. And as you've probably guessed, this man was Russell Bufalino. And just as a little tangent, this is the first instance of something that we're going to see a lot with these early flashbacks. Both De Niro and Pesci in this scene have been digitally de-aged.
I was shooting Silence in Taiwan, and Pablo, violin, came up to me and said, I think I could make them look younger.
To do this, the actors were recorded in a controlled environment so that a 3D scan of their face could be made. This would essentially act as digital makeup so that the actors could perform on set unencumbered by practical makeup. These scenes were recorded with a triple camera setup, which allowed the digital makeup of the actor to be applied to them in 3 dimensions. This was one of the things that people complained about in this film because it looks kind of weird at times, but to me, it never really broke my immersion in the movie. And another complaint that I have seen is that the de-aged Robert De Niro does not look like young Robert De Niro. But the explanation given by the team at Industrial Light and Magic is, I think, a really good one.
Keep in mind that we're not looking to recreate younger versions of the actors, but rather new creations that are younger versions of the characters.
The purpose of de-aging in this film is not to make De Niro look like a young De Niro, but to make De Niro look like a young Frank Sheeran. This makes sense, and using this technology, they were able to create a young Frank Sheeran that looks like he could feasibly grow up into how De Niro looks in the present. We then cut to Frank and some of his friends at a bar in Philly. One of his friends tells Frank that there's a man at the bar who can help him earn a commission on the steaks that he ships. Under the table, of course. I don't think I mentioned this, but Frank calls steak. That's what he's trucking. This man is the owner of the bar, and his name is Skinny Razor. All this man tells Frank is that Skinny runs an operation out of this bar and has many connections. There's plenty of good money to be made with him. And so Frank's friend introduces him to Skinny. And from then on, Frank would continue delivering steaks as usual, but some steaks would secretly be delivered to Skinny, and Frank would pocket the cash in turn. And this is how his journey in the world of organized crime began. Then one day, Frank's boss opens the truck and sees that there's no steaks inside.
You didn't realize you were driving a light horse?
No, nothing. It felt fine.
Oh, come on, Frank.
Obviously, this is because Frank has been selling steaks on the side, but he denies this, of course. But naturally, the company does press charges. Frank meets with an attorney who happens to be Bill Bufalino. And so he asks Frank a series of questions to see if there's any legal grounds that his company has.
Do you ever show up late?
No,
Do you have any moving violations?
no,
Do you drink on the job?
no.
He does throw in a probing question too. He asks if he'd be willing to provide names in exchange for a lighter sentence.
What do you think about that? Would you do that? Would
No.
you give them names?
No. No names.
This is definitely a setup, seeing if Frank is a loyal person who can be trusted. And Frank passes this test. Bill defends Frank in court, and the case is ultimately thrown out. Frank isn't sure how Bill did it because the case against him was really solid, but he doesn't question it. It's entirely possible that some intimidation was involved, but I guess we'll never know. And to celebrate, the two go to a restaurant. Skinny's there too, talking to a man that we haven't seen yet. And also there is Russell, and he and Frank meet again for the second time. Turns out Russell remembered him from the gas station. Russell leaves the two and takes a seat beside the man that was talking to Skinny. This man is Angelo Bruno. And he was the mob boss for the entire city of Philadelphia. And it is here that we get our first instance of something that we are going to see throughout this film. The camera cuts to Angelo, but then freezes, and text appears on the screen. There are many instances in this film of a character being introduced, and in the first shot that we see them, we get a freeze frame and text describing exactly how they die. There's no fanfare, and we're never meant to see these deaths. We are only meant to know that these people, these huge figures in the mob, die unceremoniously. Another thing about this technique, as well as many other editing techniques in this film, is that this film is not edited like a traditional movie. It's hard to describe without having seen the film for yourself, but The Irishman is edited like a documentary. Scorsese at this point in his career has directed 17 feature-length documentaries, and I believe that given the historical nature of this film, he chose to edit it in a documentary style way. That's enough of this tangent, back to the story. And given that Russell is sitting with Angelo Bruno, Frank makes the rightful assumption that Russell must be a big name in the mob. And since it's never explicitly said, I'm gonna say it right here. Yes, he is a big name in the mob. Russell Bufalino was the boss of the Bufalino crime family, a huge crime syndicate out of northeastern Pennsylvania. Russell in particular was a well-respected name in the Italian mafia. We will see later. And then later in the evening, Russell and Frank sit down and eat together. They break bread and they drink wine. If you know Christianity as a whole, this immediately draws a parallel to communion, where members of the church will break bread and drink wine in remembrance of Jesus. However, I don't think they're necessarily trying to make a religious comparison with this scene. It is merely to showcase the start of a friendship that will last for decades. Frank starts to speak to Russell in Italian, which catches him off guard. So he asks where an Irishman like him learned to speak Italian, to which we find out that Frank Sheeran fought in the Second World War. During his time in the 45th Infantry Division, he saw 411 days of combat. For comparison, the average soldier in World War II saw 40 days. In other words, Frank has seen some stuff, and probably done way worse stuff. For a long time in the war, he was terrified of dying, but when he saw that he was going to make it through the war, he developed an apathetic mentality of whatever happens, happens. As we will come to see, he is very detached from his actions, and this includes killing. To him, he was just following orders. When he was told to march German prisoners of war into the woods, he was just following orders. When he was told to force the POWs to dig a shallow grave and then bury them in it, he was just following orders. He does admit that he never understood.
But I never understood how they would just keep digging their own graves.
We'll get back to that later. After this conversation, Russell took a liking to Frank. Probably after he mentioned his willingness to kill and his apathy about it. He started doing odd jobs for Russell and eventually started doing jobs for Bruno himself. We then cut back to 1975 en route to the wedding. Frank pulls over so the wives can smoke and Russell naps in the front seat. It's such an ordinary scene, but it feels so real. Like I'm legitimately just watching two middle-aged couples on a road trip. Like, I can't explain it. It just feels so real.
Where are we?
We're close to Lewisburg.
Let me know when we get there. Remind me, I got some stops to make.
Okay.
And now we learn a little bit more about exactly who Russell Bufalino is. He was a man who had his pockets in any type of business you could imagine. To quote Frank in this scene, "You wanted to bribe a judge, you asked Russell. You didn't know how much to bribe him? Russell was gonna tell you. You wanted to promote one of your guys? Russell would tell you you could or you could not. You wanted to make somebody disappear? You got to get Russell's permission. And when you did something for Russ, you did it yourself."
When I ask somebody to take care of something for me, I expect them to take care of it themselves. I don't need two roads coming back to me.
When crime boss Albert Anastasia was assassinated in 1957, it was Russell they brought in to prevent a massive gang war. Somehow, everything in the Italian mafia went through Russell at one point. We then cut to the past where Frank is now officially an enforcer for the mob. He brings in a guy to Skinny Razor who's been a little evasive about the money that he owes Skinny.
I was just gonna...
In the fucking car.
I was just gonna go see him.
Yeah, don't get cute with me. You give me that bullshit about your mother. Get in the fucking car.
Frank, I swear to God, I was just gonna
Get in the fucking car.
And so, using his fists, Frank convinces this guy to give Skinny his money.
Get out of here.
I swear to God, I'll be...
Get out of here.
How am I supposed to get home?
Get out of here.
Take a fucking bus.
This scene doesn't really impact the story, it's just meant to show you that Frank is kind of the tough guy for the mob in Philadelphia right now. Frank gets home later and he sees his young daughter Peggy moping at the table. His wife tells him that she knocked over something at the grocery store and that the owner shoved her and yelled at her. Outraged, he takes Peggy right back to the grocery store. And as she waits outside, Frank attacks the owner.
Push my daughter.
He drags him out into the street, kicking him and breaking his knuckles on the curb of the street. And so Frank and his daughter walk away while this man screams in pain. This scene lays out an issue with Frank's family that we will see more of later. From his perspective, he's just protecting his family and his kids. But from Peggy's perspective, if she ever has a problem or someone yells at her, she knows that Frank will respond with violence. The family eats dinner in silence, Frank having no idea the damage that he is causing. And all the while, he continues to get closer and closer to Russell, who even baptizes his third daughter. But now with 3 young mouths to feed, Frank is in need of more money, and so he searches for odd jobs with other people downtown. Downtown is code for anyone who's involved in the mafia. And this is what leads him to Whispers de Tullio.
You want to make a quick 10 grand?
This Whispers runs his operation out of a laundry business in town, but recently he's been receiving competition from a rival laundry business, a business that has been cutting their prices and intimidating some of his workers.
To tell you the truth, I'm a little concerned.
Whenever anybody says they're a little concerned, they're very concerned.
And so he wants Frank to metaphorically and literally bomb out the competition. There's good money to be made in it, so Frank takes the job. One red flag that Frank doesn't catch on to, though, is that Whispers asks him not to tell anyone downtown about this.
And nobody has to know, especially not Skinny, because I'm not getting the money for them.
This includes Russell, Angelo, and Skinny, anyone downtown. And so Frank begins scoping out the place. He loads his trunk with gasoline and dynamite, everything that he'll need to bring this building down. But before he can do anything, Skinny pulls up and tells Frank that Angelo needs to speak to him.
What's it about? I don't know. Come on, I drag it.
Now, I love mafia movies, and that has led me to do a ton of research, both for this video and just for my own curiosity. And so I've come to know a lot of the lingo and customs of the mafia, particularly back in the day. And so with all that said, normally when a member of the mafia comes to see you and says, hey, so-and-so wants to talk to you, get in my car, we'll come pick your car up later. That normally means that you're about to be executed and you won't be back to pick up your car. Frank and Skinny arrive at Bruno's restaurant and the waiter locks the door and closes the restaurant, which is probably not a good sign. Bruno and Russell are sitting together at a table and they invite Frank to have a seat.
What are you doing in Delaware?
Bombing out a laundry place.
As it turns out, Angelo owns some stake in the laundry company that Frank was about to bomb.
No, I do. I own the other part. Not I know somebody who owns the other part.
Frank explains he was doing this job to make money and that Whispers had never told him who owned this place. Frank obviously apologizes to Bruno for his life. Angelo was originally going to have Frank killed for this, but it was Russell who convinced him not to.
You got a good friend here. You don't know how good a friend you got.
I know.
No, you don't know.
Instead, punishment for this threat will fall on Whispers, and Frank will have to do his first ever hit for the mafia. Frank arrives at the meeting place he had agreed on with Whispers and wastes no time.
Hey, there you go. I didn't know which way you were coming from. I didn't know which way you were.
There's no flashy editing or drama. It's cold and efficient. Frank fires 2 shots, Whispers collapses onto the sidewalk, and the shot hangs for a long time on his body. This is how violence is portrayed in The Irishman. It's not glorified and it's not vilified. It simply is what it is. Frank just follows his orders without a second thought. Frank disposes of the murder weapon in the Schuylkill River. In the interview with Charles Brandt, he says that this river was a common dumping spot for members of the mafia to dispose of their weapons.
If they ever send divers down there, they'd be able to arm a small country.
We cut to Frank reading the newspaper at home, and the headline is a picture of the real Whispers from the real world dead on the sidewalk. Occasionally, this film will cut away to photos or articles of the incidents that it is depicting, except the pictures will be real crime scene photos of that event. Peggy looks up at her father, almost knowing that something is wrong. After this, we get a montage of Frank dumping more weapons in that river, implying that after Whispers, he started doing more hits for the mob.
It was like the army. You followed orders. You did the right thing. You got rewarded.
But whenever he did hits for Russell, it was never for money, but out of respect to him. And at a restaurant with Russ, Frank meets a waitress by the name of Irene. Together, the two would later visit a hotel. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. It's never shown, but we all know. And after this, Frank left his wife and married Irene. And it is Irene who sits in the car with him and Russell in 1975. Speaking of 1975, the four are still on their road trip. They continue making stops so that Russell can collect money from the various businesses he's involved in. This is just a little tangent, but after watching the film for the first time, I became just completely obsessed with the car that they're driving on this road trip. The vehicle in question is a black 1975 Lincoln Continental. And after watching this film for the first time, it unironically became my dream car. I know realistically there's probably a 0% chance of me ever owning a car even similar to that, but I love this car so much. It looks so good. We then cut back to the past where Frank, Irene, and his family are bowling with Russell and his wife Carrie. The kids get along really well with Irene and Carrie, but Peggy especially is visibly nervous around Russell.
I get the feeling she don't like me, like she's afraid of me.
No, that's the way she is. She's afraid of me at times too, so she's a sensitive kid.
Because she sees all the articles in the papers of the horrible things that he does. Peggy is used in this film as almost a representation of Frank's conscience. She intuitively knows that Russ is bad news, and whenever Frank does something horrible, there's always a shot the next day of Peggy looking into Frank's eyes as if she knows exactly what he did. Frank also tells Russell that he wished he had more steady work, and that he'd love to do something for the Teamsters union that he's a part of, but there's a long line to get into any kind of position in the union. This is when Russell tells him that he may have an opportunity at the very top of the union. This is where Jimmy Hoffa enters the movie. Jimmy has been getting attacked a lot recently, and he needs a bodyguard. And so a while later, Frank and Jimmy meet over the phone. The first thing that Jimmy says to Frank is,
I heard you paint houses.
Yes, sir, I do, and I also do my own carpentry.
Which, as we know, means I hear you kill people. Frank responds saying he also does his own carpentry, which is code for he does the cleanup also. Jimmy is already impressed with Frank based on his recommendation from Russell. Russell is a hard man to please, and yet he got a glowing review from him. And then we hear a bit about Jimmy from present-day Frank. And by present, I mean in the nursing home Frank. No one born today knows who Jimmy Hoffa is, but back in the day, he was one of the most famous men in America. Next to the president, Hoffa was probably one of the most powerful people in America too. And fun fact, Al Pacino, who plays Jimmy Hoffa in the movie, was constantly listening to tapes of the real Jimmy Hoffa while on set in order to just get into that headspace and get into character for his performance. He speaks with confidence and with a vehemence that tells all those who listen to him that time is of the essence.
The day our trucks stop, America stops!
Additionally, this film also marks the first collaboration between Al Pacino and director Martin Scorsese. So, hey, we made it. Jimmy asks Frank to come to Chicago where he receives his first assignment. A rival union to the Teamsters has been signing up a bunch of non-union drivers for their union, but Hoffa wants all those people as Teamsters. Hoffa has the Chicago mayor in his pocket, and so they can basically do whatever they want in order to intimidate these drivers into joining the Teamsters union. They start by pushing rival union taxi cabs into the river, but then Frank recommends just blowing them up. Frank and a guy named Joey then prepare for a meeting with Jimmy, where Joey tells him everything he needs to know about dealing with Hoffa. Firstly, you don't ever make him wait. Always arrive early. If you're on time, you're too late. He also doesn't drink, and he doesn't allow anyone to drink around him. He also hates watermelons, so to get around the whole drinking thing, they infuse a bunch of watermelons with vodka and just eat those in the meeting with Jimmy. It's great, I love it. And after this meeting, Jimmy goes to bed. Frank being his new bodyguard, he sleeps outside of Jimmy's room. One detail about this is that Jimmy never closes the door to his room all the way. He always leaves a little gap in the door. It's never said, but this could probably be chalked up to Jimmy's paranoia. As famous and charismatic as he is a corrupt official. He likely does this because he fears that one day someone will come for him, and he wants to be able to see his attacker even while he's sleeping. Not while he's sleeping, but like when he's in bed. And as they spend more time together, Frank and Jimmy become good friends.
The wives hit it off. And with Jimmy and Josephine's kids mostly grown up and out of the house, they got a kick out of our kids too.
Peggy especially loved Jimmy. To her, he was this really good and morally righteous person.
To her, he was helping people. He was helping them make more money, live better lives. He wasn't stomping on somebody's hand.
He definitely wasn't innocent, though. His crimes were just a lot more subtle. You see, in the 1960s, the Teamsters pension fund had $8 billion in it. In a perfect world, this money was set aside so that when a union man retired, he would be financially secure with a sizable pension. This money wasn't meant to be touched, but it was. Jimmy Hoffa had a lot of mob friends who were either starting or expanding operations in a certain city in Nevada. It was the Teamster Pension Fund that built the majority of Las Vegas. This is not alleged, this is true. Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Pension Fund are the main driving force that took Las Vegas from a small roadside attraction into the city that we see today. Any loans for these projects in Vegas were run through an insurance company run by a close associate of Hoffa, Alan Dorfman. With Dorfman's introduction, we get a freeze frame saying that he was shot 8 times in the head in 1979. This is weird because he was actually killed in 1983. I am not sure why the film does this. Maybe they just didn't know, or maybe the book got it wrong. I don't know. But now you know. Play the more you know graphic. It was Russell who convinced Jimmy to give many of these mobsters their loans, and in turn, Russell would get a cut from these loans. Another client of Jimmy at the time was Sam Momo Giancana. Back during the Prohibition, Momo was an associate of Joseph P. Kennedy. The two of them were bootleggers. It was the mob who helped Joseph's son get elected President of the United States. Of course, I am talking about John F. Kennedy. And now is where we get into the strong allegedlys. There are some historical sources that allege that the mob helped JFK get elected, but this is not confirmed. This film is merely one interpretation of history, and in this interpretation, the mob helped JFK get elected. The hope of the mob was that JFK would succeed in ousting Fidel Castro as president of Cuba. Castro had kicked the mob out of their casinos in Havana, and so they got JFK elected in the hopes that they could return to that enterprise once Castro was out. Russell, being one of those people, was very involved in helping JFK get elected. But one person who hated Kennedy getting elected was Jimmy Hoffa. He hated the Kennedys so much that he gave Teamster cash to Richard Nixon's election campaign. He makes the comment that if there's one person you can't trust in this world, it's millionaires' kids, which... The movie came out in 2019, I'll leave the rest to your imagination. The more likely reason he hated the Kennedys was because Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, was then appointed United States Attorney General. And he used that position to hunt down Hoffa and uncover the corruption within the Union. He also started hunting Momo and the various other mobsters that helped his brother JFK get elected. Everyone's phones were tapped and they were being heavily monitored during this time, but the mob saw it as worth it if they could get back into Havana. Robert even had a task force made of FBI and IRS agents whose sole purpose was to just arrest Jimmy Hoffa for something. This put Hoffa under a lot of pressure, and there's this really funny scene where Jimmy just blows up at a room full of people. And it's so uncomfortable to sit through.
How do you do that? How stupid can you be? They're looking at everything I do, and you let this happen in public?
Frank brings this up with Russ, but of course he wanted JFK in office, so he's not going to do anything about this. However, he does send some guys to talk to Joseph P. Kennedy and remind him who exactly got his son elected. The hope is that they can intimidate the father into having the sons back off. He also gives Frank an assignment. He doesn't give names or specifics, he only tells Frank where to pick up the truck and where to drive the truck to. And so he arrives at the location where a bunch of soldiers unload weapons from their vehicles into Frank's truck. And by soldiers, I mean like legit US Army soldiers. Seems the mob and the US government are working quite well together in this movie, allegedly, in Minecraft. He then drops the truck off in Florida, where a man in a suit and several other men in plainclothes are waiting. These men start unloading the truck and putting the weapons in their own vehicles. As it turns out, these men are Cuban rebels, and that truck was filled with enough weapons to arm the rebels against Fidel Castro. Sound familiar? Later on the television, Frank and Russell watched the new report on the now infamous Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. In this real-world historical incident, the US armed Cuban rebels in the hopes that they would overthrow Castro, but without enough support, they were slaughtered at the Bay of Pigs. The operation was meant to be conducted with the help of US air and naval support, but it was decided at the last second that there would be no aid. This led to the Cuban rebels being massively outnumbered as a result, and they didn't win. Spoilers.
The United States, already humiliated, stood condemned by most of the countries of the world.
This was not only a military victory for Castro, but an embarrassment for the United States government. Russell looks at the TV only with disappointment. They helped to get JFK elected in the hopes that he would go after Castro, but he let them down. Looking for some good publicity after this, Robert Kennedy doubles down on his war against Hoffa.
He's looking for some cheap publicity, that's all it is. That's what he's doing. They're never gonna forget that I gave money to Nixon!
Bill Buffalino promises that they'll go talk to the old man again, but that same year, Joseph P. Kennedy had a stroke.
We're gonna get to him. He's a little sick, but...
Sick?
Yeah, but...
He had a fucking stroke! That's not sick!
We then cut to this peaceful image of an old man watching TV on his back patio, and we see the message that after a long illness, Joseph P. Kennedy died in 1969. With the FBI and the IRS closing in on him, Hoffa goes on the offensive. He gives a speech in Miami saying that they're gonna get through all this legal trouble because they
are the biggest and best and most honest union in this country. Yeah, that's right.
Which... No. He also introduces his executive vice president, a man named Frank Fitzsimmons. Since both Frank Sheeran and Frank Fitzsimmons are named Frank, I'm just gonna call Frank Sheeran Frank, and we're gonna call the other one Fitz. That's also what they call him in the movie, so it's just easier for me to remember him as Fitz. Afterwards, Jimmy and Frank retire to their hotel. Frank expresses a little bit of concern about Fitz. He doesn't really trust the guy. He doesn't seem that bright and doesn't really do much in Frank's opinion. And again, since I am saying these things about a person who actually existed in real life and probably has family out there somewhere, this is just the movie's interpretation of Fitz. But still, Jimmy thinks he can be trusted. The only person that Jimmy feels he has to worry about is the little guy. And as it turns out, the little guy is Tony Provenzano, who goes by the name Tony Pro. He was the president of Teamsters Local 560 at the time, but more importantly, he was a captain in the New Jersey Mafia. And as jovial as he appeared on the outside, he was a very ruthless mobster. When one of Pro's own guys, Tony Castellito, started rising up in the ranks of the Union and he felt threatened, Tony Pro had a hitman named Sally Bugs strangle Tony Castellito, one of his own guys. And so as Sally Bugs strangles Tony Castellito, we get the text appearing saying that Sally Bugs was shot 8 times in the head in 1979. Shot 3 times, sorry. So many people are shot 8 times, but he was shot 3. And afterwards, Pro had Sally Bugs shove Tony Castellito's body in a tree shredder. So, yeah, probably not someone you should mess with. How long have I been going? I've been going for an hour and a half already. Yeah, this is gonna be a long one. Sorry, gamers. To Jimmy, Pro was threatening the reputation of the Union. Pro threatens anyone who gets in his way, and he's not as subtle with it as Jimmy.
I mean, you threaten people once in a while. Okay, I understand. But all the time, it's drawing attention to us.
And so to try and combat this, Jimmy wants more of his own guys in positions of power in the different locals. And as a matter of fact, he wants Frank to run for president of Local 326 in Delaware. And so this is how Frank comes from being a truck driver to a hitman, the president of Local 326. In this new position, we see Frank as president offering legal advice to a younger driver who is in some legal trouble. This scene directly parallels the scene with Frank and Bill Buffalino way earlier when he was in trouble, but this time he's in the other seat. In the meantime, Jimmy Hoffa is enduring a grand jury trial in Nashville on suspicion of money laundering. During the proceedings, a man walks right up to Jimmy Hoffa, pulls out a gun, and fires. And that's how the movie ends. Directed by Larry David. Outraged, Jimmy and a man named Chucky O'Brien jump the stands and take this guy down to the ground and start beating him. Chucky was a close assistant to Jimmy Hoffa, to the point where he was often referred to as Hoffa's stepson.
That's my kid. I raised this kid. You see him? You see what he did?
The gun in question was an air gun, but it could have been a lot worse. Jimmy praises Chucky in front of the courtroom for his response.
You charge a guy, always charge a guy with a gun. With a knife, you run away. Run away from a knife. So you charge with a gun, with a knife, you run.
I've seen mixed reports on the name of the would-be assassin. Some places say Robert Gray Reynolds Jr., and others say Warren Swanson. It's unclear. I couldn't find any verifiable sources. In the movie, he said he received word from a higher power telling him to shoot Jimmy Hoffa. It is very likely that after enduring as many grand juries as Hoffa has had to, he staged this as a publicity stunt in order to boost his reputation in the papers. And yet the trial in Nashville goes on. Frank flies in too, and all of Jimmy's people begin to identify the members of this jury. The hope is that they can threaten and intimidate enough of the jury members in order to avoid a conviction. And while they research these members of the jury, the Cuban Missile Crisis is unfolding on the news in real time. It's really cool because it places this story against the backdrop of American history. I love it. After months of enduring this grand jury and trying to intimidate witnesses, Frank, Jimmy, Bill Buffalino, and Chucky all go to an ice cream shop to discuss strategy. And as they visit, someone in the shop shouts, and everyone in the store immediately crowds around the TV. It's all over the news.
These details about the same as previously. President Kennedy shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas.
After this bulletin, an ad for Nescafe coffee comes up. Perfect ad placement, spot on. If this took place in modern day, it would be something like,
President Kennedy has just been shot in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas.
Whopper, 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 whopper. Like, TV hits different, man. Everyone stares at the TV waiting for an update, all except Hoffa, who goes back to eating his ice cream. The ad gets cut off, and news of Kennedy's death hits the news.
The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
All of the American flags around Nashville and across America are flying now at half-mast. Hoffa is interviewed outside the Teamsters building in Nashville about whether or not he will attend the president's funeral, to which he simply brushes it off. He hated the Kennedys, and so he's not really teared up about this death. They ask what he would say if he were to show up at the funeral and be allowed to speak, which he responds,
I'd say, Bobby Kennedy is just another lawyer now.
Then he looks up and realizes that the flag at the top of the Teamsters building is flying at half-mast, just like all the others. He immediately goes to the roof to ensure that the American flag on his building is flown at full mast, a final insult to the Kennedys who he hated so much. And sure enough, Bobby Kennedy officially stepped down as Attorney General, thus ending his war with Hoffa. However, the grand jury in Nashville didn't quite go as planned. It was found out that Hoffa was intimidating the jury, and this was added to his list of crimes. I'm just gonna read these off. Jimmy Hoffa was convicted on charges of attempted bribery, jury tampering, conspiracy, and mail and wire fraud. He was then shipped to prison where he would serve an aggregate sentence of 13 years. Despite being in prison, he still controlled the union for a number of years through his number 2, Fitz.
Are you aware you're late? That's all I want to know. Do you know you're late?
I'm sorry I'm late, Jimmy, but we got a lot going on.
I don't want to hear that.
Meanwhile, Bill Buffalino and Alan Dorfman controlled all of Jimmy's loans, meaning that the Mafias still got their money. The mob loved Fitz because they could get as much money as they wanted. Jimmy was a lot more controlling over the union pension fund, but Fitz was a pushover. Jimmy knows this and isn't too happy, but Russell and the other bosses love Fitz because, again, he's giving them everything they want.
We like Fitz. I'll tell you what the problem is. Jimmy's got that ball-busting Dorfman holding up loans that Fitz already okayed.
Russell asks Frank to scare Dorfman, so he shoots up his car. And from then on, Dorfman okayed any loans that they wanted. That same year, Tony Pro was arrested for extortion and sent to the same prison that Hoffa was at. We see him playing a card game with some of his buddies when FBI agents come to make the arrest.
I'm Agent DeGregorio of the FBI. I have a warrant for your arrest. Please stand.
Can I finish my hand?
No, sir. Please stand.
One of the guys at the table gets his own freeze frame, but unlike the others, his is oddly wholesome. Anthony Tony Jack Giancolone, well liked by all, died of natural causes February 23rd, 2001, which is less than a week from my birthday. That's not really important to the story, I just thought it was neat. I'm 23 now, happy birthday to me.
Hip hooray! Hip hooray!
Of course I looked up Tony Jack thinking this was probably just a rose-tinted look at a known mobster. And still, in terms of mobsters, his story is a lot more wholesome than others. He was only ever indicted on various financial crimes, nothing violent, and he was arrested in 1976 for tax evasion. Of course, I'm not condoning tax evasion, but he served 10 years for tax evasion, whereas there are other people in this story who got a lesser sentence who literally killed people. This is why the Joker's okay with killing as many people as you want, but as soon as the IRS is involved, he's like, yes, sir.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS? No, thank you.
And now in prison, we get a confrontation between Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Pro. Pro is having trouble accessing his pension fund, and he wants Jimmy to look into it. Jimmy initially refuses, saying that he's in jail and can't help him, but then he tells Pro that he forfeited his pension when he got arrested.
So yours forfeited too?
No.
This frustrates Pro because Hoffa's pension is still safe and secure. Jimmy justifies this, saying that he's only in jail for fraud, but Pro is in here for extortion, which is a violent crime.
I didn't threaten anybody. You did.
Well, so what? That makes no sense.
What do you mean? It does.
No, it doesn't, but I don't want to debate.
Think about it.
The thing with Jimmy in this movie is he has all these rational explanations, but in reality, Pro just doesn't get access to his pension fund because Jimmy doesn't like him. And so they bash heads like this for a while, neither of them yielding. Pro says that he wants what he's owed, and Jimmy makes a comment about you people, which, not a good look.
You people. You people.
What'd you say?
Oh my God.
What did you say?
Oh, come on, what I said.
Pro attacks him, and after a while, the guards step in. This is a moment that was completely improvised by Stephen Graham, the actor for Pro, and so Al Pacino's reaction to being attacked was very genuine. It's also very shocking, especially considering that Al Pacino was nearly 80 years old when they filmed this movie.
You're done? I'll rip your fucking head off! Fucking hey! I'll fucking kill you!
Thus began what I can only assume to be a beautiful and wholesome buddy movie where two guys in prison are united through similar circumstances and become the best of friends. Or they just hated each other from then on. We then cut to Frank in the nursing home where he says right then was when things started to fall apart. This is where Jimmy's relationship with the mafia began to sour. Then in 1971, Joseph Colombo was shot by an African-American man named Jerome A. Johnson, who was immediately killed by Joe's bodyguards. For those who don't know why this is a huge deal, you may know that in the 70s and beyond that, but primarily the 70s, New York was kind of owned by 5 major crime families, the 5 families. These families essentially ran the city, and they had connections with businessmen, judges, politicians, basically anyone could have been in their pocket. One of these families was the Colombo family, and Joe Colombo was their boss. This assassination attempt ignited what was to be the Second Colombo War. Despite being shot 3 times, Colombo did survive, though he was permanently paralyzed by this attack. And in the eyes of the mafia at the time, there was only one guy who was crazy enough to shoot Joe Colombo, and that was Joseph Gallo, also known as Crazy Joe. He openly despised Colombo. He had just gotten out of prison that year, and while this has never been confirmed, both the mob and this movie believe that Joey Gallo was the one who ordered the hit. The mob also didn't like Joe because he was such a famous mobster in the public eye.
I mean, who the hell else runs around with show business people like that? Getting his picture taken in the papers all the time, drawing attention to himself and everybody. What is that?
And so Frank and Russell find themselves at a comedy club with Joe Gallo where he is celebrating his 43rd birthday. He insults Russell for wearing a pin of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, the league that was hosting the parade and celebration that Joe Colombo was shot at.
You really believe in that bullshit league?
Well, it's not that. It's Italian.
Joe.
What'd I say?
He's practically declaring to Russell and everyone around that he's the one who did it. Frank, being Russell's enforcer, he backs Joe off and tries to defuse the situation.
You can't say that stuff like that here. Okay, you can't do that.
Why not? Dick Rickles is the only one who can make jokes.
The man's a boss.
So I'm a boss.
Eventually, Joe leaves and Frank sits back down with Russell. All Russ does is look at Frank, and he gets the message. Crazy Joe has to go. This is both a testament to how close the two are, and also how terrifying Russell is as a boss. All he has to do is give a certain look, and someone gets killed. So Frank goes back home and decides what weapon he'll need. He's been doing hits for so long that he knows exactly what kind of weapon would be best for this situation.
Now, for something like this, you're gonna need two guns. The one you're gonna use, and a backup.
The hit would take place at Umberto's Clam House. It was late enough in the day that all the tourists would be gone, but Joey would be celebrating there with his family. In a really cold moment for Frank, he says that the family being there is a good thing because it will teach them a lesson in what it means to mess with the mob. All Frank's driver knew was that he was gonna drop Frank off, circle the block, and pick Frank up. Everyone involved in this operation only knew enough to carry out their task. And so Frank enters the diner, pulls out his guns, and murders Joe Gallo. In the real world, this murder remains unsolved. But in Frank's later confession, which inspired the book, which inspired the movie, it was he who killed Joey Gallo. As Frank sits down to eat breakfast, news of Joe's murder is all over the news. He turns, and a now fully grown Peggy is staring at the TV and staring at him. Again, she is kind of portrayed as this representation of conscience. She seems to know that it was Frank who killed Joe, so she casts judgment on him. In December of 1971, with $500,000 slid under the table to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, Jimmy Hoffa receives a presidential pardon and leaves jail. And he immediately redirects his efforts into trying to become president of the Teamsters again.
I'm gonna take back control of my union.
How you gonna do that, Jimmy?
If we hear noise at some point, supper's being made not too far away from here. I've been going for nearly 2 hours now. This is gonna be a big one. Hoffa will be running against his former number 2, Frank Fitzsimmons. It'll be an uphill battle, especially since the mob favors Fitz, who gives them whatever they want. But Hoffa still has many supporters. All he needs to do is get some of Pro's votes.
I just can't believe I gotta go to Tony Pro to get votes. What is that?
And in order to do that, he's gonna have to get an official endorsement from Tony Pro, which that's probably not gonna happen.
I want to make up with you. I need you to endorse me, please, Tony. I'm not gonna get through this.
And so they set up a meeting between Hoffa and Pro. Tony and his cousin Tony Jack show up late, which is Jimmy's biggest pet peeve.
This isn't right. This isn't right. You don't do this. You don't keep a man waiting.
I know.
And when he does arrive, he's wearing shorts, which is very disrespectful in Hoffa's eyes.
Can you believe this weather, Frank? Huh? It's 85 degrees outside.
So we're already off to a bad start. Jimmy begrudgingly asks for an endorsement, but first Pro wants an apology for the "you people" comment that he made in prison. And the two immediately start spitting venom at each other.
That's what you said, right, Jim?
You people. Am I beneath you?
Definitely.
Frank and Tony Jack both try their best to calm them down, but they really hate each other. Jimmy calls Tony another racial slur, and Tony threatens to kill Jimmy's granddaughter, and the two start fighting again. Spoiler alert, this meeting went horribly. Jimmy asks Frank if there's any way that Russell would give the okay to put a hit out on Pro, but that's not gonna happen. But still, Frank pleads the case with Russell and with famous mobster Anthony Salerno, who also goes by the name Fat Tony. Tony doesn't approve of what Pro said, but Pro's a big name in the mob, and so it's not as simple as just, all right, we'll just kill him. And so they both send Frank to try and get Jimmy to calm down, but that doesn't work.
That's not making me calm down. Standing by me. What the fuck does that mean?
Since the mob won't kill Pro, Jimmy is forced to actually campaign. They won't just kill this guy. I have to actually try and campaign. And so he runs a smear campaign against Fitz, saying that Fitz is never even at work. He's always just out playing golf with Richard Nixon and the Attorney General. Fitz responds to this smear campaign by blowing up a boat belonging to a friend of Jimmy's. Jimmy responds to this by blowing up Fitz's son's car. And Fitz responds to this by firing Jimmy's wife from her union job. There's a great moment where Jo is taking all her stuff out to the car, and as soon as she puts the key in the ignition, the music just cuts out and it goes dead quiet. She's clearly terrified that if she starts the car, it'll explode. Thankfully it doesn't, but this situation has clearly escalated out of hand. And as this situation unfolds, Frank watches the news of the Watergate scandal on TV. Among the people in those proceedings is the man in the suit that Frank dropped off all the weapons with. The guy who was there with all of the Cuban rebels that he was arming for their fight against Castro. This man was Everett Howard Hunt Jr., a former agent for the CIA. And at the time, he was an aide to Richard Nixon, who was implicated in the Watergate scandal. And in doing my research on Howard Hunt, I found an official declassified CIA document confirming that Howard Hunt was in Dallas, Texas when JFK was killed, and that the CIA attempted to cover it up, which I'm sure that's fine. That's nothing to worry about, nothing to be concerned about at all. I'm sure that's fine, and that Lee Harvey Oswald was indeed the only shooter who acted alone. There is no conspiracy. There is no cover-up. Why are you still here? Leave a like if you think Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter. He wasn't even a metal bender. The bullet just did that. Meanwhile, Jimmy continues on his anti-Fitz campaign. He accuses Fitz of selling the Union out to the Mafia, which is true. Jimmy also did this, but like a good politician, he conveniently ignores that. He, of course, vows that no Teamster money will ever go to the Mafia if he's elected president. Of course, this is a lie, but Tony Salerno doesn't see it that way. Tony strongly suggests that Jimmy give up, cash in his pension, and live a nice life with his wife and family. This is a nice thought, but Tony definitely means that he'll kill Jimmy if he keeps trying to become president. The mob already has a Teamster president who will give them everything they want. They don't need Jimmy anymore. Frank tells Jimmy this, but he doesn't back down. He views the Teamsters as his union, and no one is gonna stop him from trying to take it back. Tony responds by openly threatening him.
Well, before he says something like that, he should remember that Joe Gallo liked to make a lot of fucking noise too.
Bullshit. Tony.
He said that?
Yeah,
oh, that's it. That does it.
But rather than this scaring Jimmy, it only makes him double down. I don't know how short this is cut down to, but I just passed the 2-hour mark of recording this video. I take a lot of gaps in between, and there's a lot of takes that you don't see. While Frank and Jimmy talk about this, Frank mentions that Local 326 is putting together a testimonial dinner for him, and that he wants Jimmy to be there to present the award to him. The only catch is that all of Frank's mob friends will be there too, and Jimmy might be uncomfortable because they all want to kill him. But Jimmy doesn't care. They've been friends at this point for over 20 years, and he'd be honored to present this award to Frank. And so the dinner arrives. Everyone's there, including Frank's buddies from World War II, the locals, the local union members, and of course, everyone from downtown. That includes Russell, Tony Pro, Salerno, Angelo, Skinny, everyone's there. The MC for the event is John McCullough, the president of the Roofers Union, who would be shot 6 times in 1980. And as everyone eats their dinner, Salerno talks with Russell. He tells Russ that somehow Jimmy is holding up loans, and he says that when he's elected president, he's gonna call in the old loans.
He goes, once Fitz is out and he's in, he's gonna call in the old loans. Hotels, casinos, real estate, no matter what it is.
This means that the mob will have to pay back every penny that they've borrowed, which at this point is probably a lot, about one Las Vegas worth. Russell then goes to talk to Jimmy about this, and as it turns out, it's all true.
It's not about money.
If it's not about money, then I'm really having trouble understanding, because I don't know what all the talk is about.
It's my union.
He really is just like digging his grave deeper and deeper. It's amazing.
But I never understood how they would just keep digging their own graves.
It's clear that Russell is trying so hard to help Jimmy out of this, but Jimmy won't back down.
I'm trying to help you, Jim.
I know you. But nobody threatens Hoffa.
And so Jimmy walks away. Russell has done all that he can. Jimmy gives his speech about Frank and presents him with the award. Frank in turn gives a speech thanking everyone for being here and reaffirming his friendship with Jimmy Hoffa.
I'm behind you, Jimmy. All the way.
He has no idea that he is inadvertently choosing a side. They all take pictures and Jimmy presents Frank with a gold watch, the same watch that we see him wearing in the nursing home decades later, a token of his friendship with Hoffa. Then everyone takes to the dance floor while Italian-American pop singer Jerry Vale performs on stage. Peggy Sheeran dances with Jimmy, a friend of Frank who has been like a second father to her for over 20 years. As they dance, she sees Russell and Tony Salerno staring seriously at Jimmy. Tony Pro is whispering in his ear. I'm not sure how much Peggy knew about Frank's life, but she definitely knew that they are dangerous people and that they have Hoffa in their sights. After this, Russell meets one-on-one with his old friend, Frank. He gives him a large golden ring, the same ring he's wearing in the nursing home decades later.
Only 3 people in the world have one of these, and only one of them is Irish. I have one, Angelo has one, now you have one.
Russell sees Frank as a friend and as his protege. He made Frank the powerful man that he is today.
You know how strong I made you? You know how strong? You're my kid. Nobody can fuck with you.
The two look down from the balcony and see Jimmy visiting down below. It is then that Russell tells Frank that things have gotten out of hand with Jimmy, and that it's bad. Real bad. Russell doesn't have beef with Jimmy, but many other powerful mobsters do.
It's at a point where you're gonna have to talk to him and tell him it's what it is.
What it is?
Yes, it's what they want.
The Mafia loves to speak very cryptically, but when someone says it is what it is, or it's what it is, it's the bottom line. Frank knows this, and he really wishes he could get Jimmy to listen.
You know, I talked to him. He's a tough guy to talk to. You know him.
He has no choice. He has no choice. These are the higher-ups.
The higher-ups in the mob want him gone, and there's not much that he can do about that. Frank, still at least a little naive, convinces himself that Jimmy's a higher-up too, but Russell knows better.
Well, he's a higher-up too. I mean, no.
Not like this. You know that. Oh, come on, Frank.
He's a powerful man, but in the realm of the Mafia is nothing. Russell leans in close to Frank and says,
if they can whack a president, they can whack a president of a union. You know it, and I know it.
This implies that after his failure to get the mob back into Cuba, the mob had JFK killed. Of course, like I've said, this is just one interpretation of history. I don't really believe that the mob ordered JFK's death, but in this movie, the Mafia was powerful enough to kill the President of the United States, and that should scare Hoffa. This is his last chance. If Frank can't talk Jimmy down in here and now, it's what it is. Suddenly confronted with this reality, the confident and intimidating Frank we've seen is immediately replaced with the stuttering and mumbling Frank from the beginning of the movie.
I talked to this guy, I talked to him. He said, he don't listen, but he's got to listen now. I got to make him listen. And he's just fucking knuckleheads.
And so Frank tries desperately to calm Jimmy down. He brings up that it's gotten to the point that it's what it is.
What it is. It's what it is. Please, listen to me. They wouldn't dare.
Jimmy has records of all of his dealings with the mafia. He believes that if he disappears, then the mafia is done for. He's trying to use that blackmail as a shield, not realizing that his shield is made of paper.
What you're saying is what they're concerned about.
What I'm saying is I know things. I know things. They don't know I know.
He tells Frank he would never do anything to hurt Russell, but if anyone comes after him, they're done. That's where the conversation ends. Frank tried his best, but Jimmy has run out of lifeline.
Listen to me. At the end, there's only one thing that's real. This is my union.
Jimmy and Peggy then dance one more time. Peggy looks back at her father and sees a man who is in mourning, even though his friend is still alive. All of these events bring us to 1975 and that road trip to the wedding in Detroit. As we find out now, that wedding is also a peace mission. One last chance, one last meeting with Jimmy. Try and solve this for good. Frank calls Jimmy and finds out that he has arranged a meeting with Pro and Tony Jack, Pro's cousin. Frank senses a trap and tells Jimmy to wait till he gets there. Later that day, Frank and Russell meet in the kitchen of the hotel. It's kind of implied that Russell owns this hotel, because he's just kind of allowed everywhere. He tells Frank there's been a change of plans, and they're gonna be staying here in the hotel one more day.
We're gonna hang around tomorrow morning and then go up, drive up.
Well, but I told Jimmy that we were going to be up in the morning.
Frank questions why, because he has to be in Detroit tomorrow for the meeting with Pro. He's a little frantic about it, knowing what's about to happen.
We gotta go there. I mean, I gotta go. I told him I'd be there.
And it is then that Russell looks down and says,
Frankie, we did all we could for the man.
He tells Frank not to call Jimmy and warn him, but tomorrow, he's gone. It's what it is. And so Frank lays in bed all night, unable to sleep. He looks at the phone, considering calling Jim. He is being forced to take a side. His friend who made him the man that he is today, or his best friend of over 20 years at this point. A man who has been like a second father to his children. He makes his choice and doesn't call Jimmy. And in the morning, him and Russell have breakfast. Russell tells him that the two are going to be driving to Port Clinton. There's a plane there waiting for Frank. He's supposed to fly to Detroit and then in a couple hours come back, and they'll drive back to the hotel and meet with their wives. Hearing this, Frank's stomach drops, because he knows exactly what that means. And this is where the cruelty of the mafia that he has pledged his allegiance to for all these decades is revealed.
Frank, I had to put you into this thing, or you would never let it happen.
No matter what Frank wants to say, Jimmy Hoffa dies today. Would he rather Jimmy be killed slowly and painfully by someone who hates him, or by someone who loves Jimmy and would make it quick?
Either way, he's going.
Having burned up all his connections with the mob, Jimmy Hoffa signed his own death warrant, not realizing that it would be his best friend who would come to collect it. Frank doesn't say anything. There's no tears, no attempts to bargain with Russell. But his expression says it all. In the war, he was just a soldier following orders. When he started doing hits for the mob, he was just a soldier following orders. And it is this attitude that has brought him to this moment, where now he has to put aside his feelings and follow orders.
But I never understood how they would just keep digging their own graves.
The following sequence of events takes place over the course of 15 minutes, but it feels like more than 20. Scorsese really makes it drag on, so we feel that sense of impending dread that Frank must feel. Imagine being sent to kill your best friend. I bet the world around you would slow down a lot too. He doesn't say a word, and there's no music to accompany this next sequence of events. The two drive to an airport in Port Clinton where Frank boards a plane. He then gets a car in Detroit and drives to the house. On the way, he passes Jimmy in his car outside of the Red Fox Diner. This is the same diner where his car would be found by FBI agents. Frank doesn't stop, but continues driving to the house. And like I said, there's no soundtrack that plays throughout any of this. It's like the entire movie is holding its breath, dreading what's about to happen. He arrives and inspects the house. Sally Bugs is laying down new linoleum flooring on the ground so that no bloodstains will get on the original floor. This is the house where one of the most powerful men in America will meet his end. Another car pulls up outside, and the driver is Chucky, the assistant to Jimmy Hoffa, who was like a son to him. He doesn't know anything about what's about to happen. He only knows that they're gonna pick up Jimmy and drop him off here at the house. Sally tells Frank to take the front seat, but Frank insists on taking the back seat. Two go back and forth, but Frank raises his voice and puts his foot down.
I'll sit here, you take the front.
No. I'll sit there. I'm not sitting there. I'm sitting there.
All right, sit where you want.
There could be a couple explanations for this. One of which is that the only other time we've seen Sally Bugs is that he was strangling a guy from the back seat of a car. It's entirely possible that Frank thought Pro would have him killed too for being friends with Jimmy, and so he wants to avoid the possibility of that. The other explanation that I think is much more likely is that he just wants to sit beside Jimmy one last time before he does what he has to do. The back seat is wet and it smells slightly. Chucky says that he was delivering a frozen fish for a friend. This conversation is actually really important, but I'm going to explain that in my analysis. I'm not going to spoil the magic now. As they drive, Sally Bugs asks what kind of fish it was, but Chucky has no idea.
There was a fish waiting for me there. I didn't ask what kind of fish it was, I'm sorry.
All Chucky had to do was pick the fish up and drop it off. What does it matter what kind of fish it was or where it came from? He didn't really bother asking any of these questions. Sally says that he wants to be able to explain this story if someone asks him about it, and that requires that he know information like what kind of fish it was and where he got it from. And after this dialogue, they pull up to Jimmy's car. Jimmy is confused why Chucky is here, and he has no idea who Sally Bugs is, and he's annoyed that they all kept him waiting. Sally lies and says that Pro and Russell are at the house waiting for Jimmy.
I don't wait for anybody more than 10 minutes.
He's at the house.
What house?
With Russ.
Jimmy is beyond confused, but all of that goes away when he sees Frank in the back seat. Frank lies too, saying that Russell is at the house and he doesn't want to meet here where agents can be spying on them.
I was waiting for you. I was there at 2 o'clock. You're supposed to show. What happened?
I'm sorry, but McGee's here. He decided to come. But he ain't comfortable here. He don't want to come here. He's at the house.
Sally tells Jimmy that they'll bring him back to pick up his car. You'll remember what I said earlier in the video about when mobsters say that it's bad.
We'll bring you back after you get your car.
You will not be back to get your car. Only after Frank tells Jimmy that it's safe does he get in the car. The last violation of trust. The two old friends hug, but Frank holds on for just a little longer. Sally tells Jimmy that Chucky had a fish in the back and that's what the smell is.
Chuck, listen to me. Never put a fish in your car. You never get the smell out. Unless you pack it tight, you know?
No, I know.
As they pull up to the house, Jimmy quietly asks Frank if he's carrying a gun. He still doesn't trust Pro and wants to be prepared in case they need to shoot their way out of that house. Frank's expression after this is pure dread and grief, as the gun he's carrying isn't meant for Pro. Chucky pulls up to the house, Frank and Jimmy get out, while Chucky and Sally pull out and leave. Jimmy steps into the house with Frank right behind him. The first thing he notices is the house is completely empty. There's no sign of Russell or Pro. And then...
Let's get out of here, Frank. Come on.
Frank drags Jimmy's body to the middle of the floor and places the murder weapon on top of him. Then he leaves, but the camera lingers on Jimmy's body for a longer moment. Jimmy thought he was invincible, but when all of his connections with the mob had soured, one of the most powerful men in America met his end in an unknown house. And he never saw it coming because the mob sent his best friend to do it. Frank flies back and meets up with Russell. The two don't say a word to each other the entire drive back to the hotel. The wedding of Bill Buffalino's daughter arrives, and Frank Russell and both their wives are there. Everyone in the room is smiling, all except Frank. And back home, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is all over the news. The first face we see reacting to the news is Peggy. Frank asks the family if there's been any word on Jimmy's disappearance, but the authorities are stumped. Frank comments that he should go and call Jo, Jimmy's wife, to which the family is surprised that he hasn't called her already. All Peggy says is,
"Why?
What?
Why?"
Why what?
She stares at her father, who can't meet her gaze. I've talked about Peggy representing Frank's conscience before, and now it almost seems as though she's asking him why he did it. This is before finally finishing her question and asking,
"Why haven't you called Jo?"
Do you think the abduction was for ransom? We don't know yet.
I'm gonna call her now.
And that day, August 3rd, 1975, was the last day that Peggy ever spoke to her father. She never says it out loud, but I think she knew. And so Frank goes upstairs to call Jo.
Hello? Hello? Joe. It's
Frank.
Yeah. Yeah.
She is, of course, hysterical, panicked to the point of tears. And this immediately breaks Frank.
Frank, do you think he's alive?
He's gotta be.
He had been dreading this call, where he'd have to call not only the wife of a close friend of him and his wife, but also the wife of a man that he murdered. He had never allowed himself to confront the idea that the people he killed had families before. But here, it's like he's hearing the voices of all the people who don't have somebody because of him. And still he lies. He gives her hope that maybe he's fine and that it's all going to be okay. He tells her it's going to be okay, but I feel like he's also trying to tell himself that too.
It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. He's gonna be...
Jo hangs up the phone, and Frank just sits there in complete silence. For most of the movie, Frank is shown in close-ups, making him into this very big, intimidating figure that an enforcer for the mob would be. But here, we cut to a shot of his bedroom, and sitting there on the bed facing away from the camera, he looks so small. No matter how powerful he is, he was just a pawn for other more powerful people. And this road of power and following orders led him to kill his best friend.
But I never understood how they would just keep digging their own graves.
In the night, two guys go to the house to wrap Jimmy's body in a bag. They take him to a funeral home where they place him in a cardboard coffin and cremate the body. Of course, everyone who knew Jimmy was inevitably called in for questioning, and this included Frank.
When did I first meet?
When did you first meet Jimmy Hoffa?
Quite a while back.
Everyone, of course, pled the Fifth, which for any non-Americans, including myself, the Fifth Amendment is the right to not answer any questions pertaining to an infamous crime unless indicted by a grand jury. Everyone got indicted and convicted of something, but not Hoffa. The two mobsters who disposed of the body, Bruno Denzetta and Marco Rossi, both got 20 years for intimidation. Bro was also convicted on that same charge, but was already in jail for the murder of Tony Castellito. Sally Bugs was brought in for questioning, but he didn't tell anyone beforehand. In the mob, you're always supposed to talk to someone in your family before going in. Otherwise, it looks like you might be snitching.
But Sally knows better. How come he didn't say anything to anybody? He didn't tell anybody one word. Not one word.
Russell talks about this and then gives Frank a familiar look. That night, Frank and one other man meet up with Sally Bugs.
Sally, what's doing?
Hey, Irish.
As it turns out, Sally did tell somebody, but that somebody forgot to tell somebody else. And so, Sally Bugs died pointlessly. Chucky didn't know anything about his involvement with Hoffa's disappearance, but the FBI still gave him 10 months over something about a car. It's unclear what in the movie, and in my research I couldn't find anything, so 10 months for a car. I don't know what. Tony Salerno was convicted on racketeering charges, and Russell Bufalino was arrested on conspiracy to kill a witness. Specifically, he ordered Jimmy the Weasel to strangle a guy called Jack Napoli. As it turns out, the Weasel was wearing a wire on him, and so they brought Russell in. Frank Sheeran was brought up on charges of labor racketeering, murder, attempted murder, intimidation, embezzlement, and arson, but he was only convicted on labor racketeering. There in prison, even some of the most powerful men in America were not immune to the struggles that all humans face, and that is mortality. Russell had a stroke, Tony Salerno was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and Frank's arthritis reached his back. He was starting to lose feeling in his legs. He couldn't have a cane, so they put him on medicine for the pain, but it also had a series of side effects that left him permanently fatigued and drowsy. I'm gonna break now for dinner. I'm almost at the 3-hour mark. Oh boy. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. I'm gonna go eat food and then we'll be right back to it. In the prison cafeteria, Frank and Russell break bread and drink grape juice. This parallels the beginning of their friendship all those decades ago when they first broke bread and wine. And drank wine. They didn't break the wine. Also, hi, I'm back. The acting is really good, especially from Joe Pesci. Russell has had a stroke at this point, and he plays it frighteningly well. As they sit there, Russell makes the comment that Jimmy was a good man, and he really wished that things didn't have to end the way they did. He looks at Frank and sees that even 20 or so years later, he is still haunted by what he had to do. Russell tries to alleviate Frank's conscience, saying that it was his call and his responsibility for Jimmy dying.
I picked us over him. Fuck him. Fuck him. Fuck him.
But oddly enough, that doesn't offer comfort to the man who killed him. Russell and Frank are friends, but he also views Frank as a son figure, someone that he took from his lowly truck driving position and made him as powerful as he was. And now sitting in prison breaking bread together, he says a phrase to Frank in Italian,
Mangia che cresci, figlimi, mangia.
Which translates to, eat so that you grow. My son, eat. And one day, Frank sees Russell being wheeled away by another inmate.
Where you going?
I'm going to church.
Church?
Don't laugh, you'll see. Don't laugh. You'll see.
He went to church, and then to the hospital, and then on February 25th, 1994, Russell Bufalino died. Frank got out of prison, and then in 1995, his wife Irene died from lung cancer from a lifetime of smoking. Peggy attended the funeral, but she didn't once look at her father. And back home, Frank limps around the house with the use of a cane. He disposes of all the cigarettes in his wife's many ashtrays around the house. He used to be a powerful mobster and a Teamsters local president. He knew the most powerful people in America and considered them his friends. But now he's just an old man who can barely walk. It's never said, but the way that it's shown is very humbling. And there's two shots in this sequence that devastated me the first time I saw this film, and it's just Frank sitting alone in his house watching baseball on the TV. This scene is only 2 shots, but in both of those shots, it looks exactly like my grandfather. From his appearance, to his clothing, to him sitting in an armchair watching TV, he is the spitting image of my grandpa. This really hit home for me and re-emphasized the message of the movie to me. Frank and my grandpa walked completely different paths in life. Their stories are not similar in any way, and yet they both end up in the exact same position, but with one major difference. And that is that Frank Sheeran has no one. His children don't speak to him because he was at best an absentee father and at worst a terrifying father who would just violently attack anyone who messed with his family. His wife is now dead, and all of his friends and the powerful people that he surrounded himself with either died of natural causes or were killed over something purposeless. He truly has no one in this world. In another shot, he's shown putting his pills into one of those containers where you have pills for each day, but he spills the pills all over the counter because he can no longer control his shaky hands. And in the night, he limps down the hallway, breathing heavily from the effort it takes just to walk a few steps. And so he takes a few steps, drops his cane, and slowly collapses on the floor, unable to get up. This brings us full circle to Old Man Frank, who sits in a nursing home in a wheelchair. On the TV is news of the Kosovo War, meaning that the year is either 1998 or 1999. It is sometime during his stay here that he makes the confession to Charles Brandt that we have heard narrating this whole film. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Charles actually interviewed Frank in prison, but in the movie I believe that Charles interviewed him in this nursing home. It is during this time that Frank is diagnosed with cancer. It's never said in the movie, but in real life that's what happened. He still travels around town, but only with the help of an orderly, and he walks with the assistance of 2 crutches. He goes to the bank where Peggy works in an attempt to reach out to her, but she just leaves without saying a word to him.
Peggy, I just want to talk.
And so he visits another one of his daughters who hopes that she can get him in touch with Peggy. He wants to apologize, and when she asks what for, he says for being a bad dad.
I know I wasn't a good dad. I know that. I was just trying to protect her, protect all of yous.
So at least he acknowledges that. He tried to protect them by sheltering his children from the world and the things that he had seen. And at this point she starts crying because she realizes that he missed the point entirely.
There are not a lot of bad people out there. What else am I gonna do?
Daddy, you have no idea what it was like for us.
To her, the problem was they couldn't tell their father anything about the troubles in their life because of the horrible things he did. The problem wasn't with the world, the problem was him, and he still can't realize.
I mean, we couldn't go to you with a problem because of what you would do. You know, we couldn't come to you for protection because of the terrible things that you would do.
And so he is still alone. And then he goes shopping for caskets. There's no one in his life to make the arrangements for him, so he has to do it himself. He chooses a shiny green coffin out of respect to his Irish heritage. He then picks a burial spot for himself. Frank remarks to himself that everybody on this earth has an expiration date at some point. And while he doesn't know what, he always assumed that there was something after death. He doesn't want to be cremated, and he doesn't want to be buried underground because that seems so final. But being buried in a mausoleum while he's still dead, it doesn't feel as final. And so he chooses to be buried in spot 1948. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to find the reason for this because it seems like a very specific detail to include in the movie. Frank met Russell Bufalino in 1955, so it's not that, and it can't be anything related to Jimmy because he met Jimmy long after he met Russell. And so after spending nearly an hour researching this one detail, I think I might have something. Peggy Sheeran was born in 1949. So I believe he may have picked spot 1948 because that was the year that his first wife became pregnant with Peggy. And this makes sense to me, at least based on his characterization in the film. He was a terrible father, but he did genuinely love his children. And so he chose a burial spot that shares a number with one of the best moments in his life, the birth of a daughter who will no longer speak to him. That way, even beyond the grave, will feel some sort of connection to his daughter, a connection that he severed when he betrayed her trust and killed Jimmy Hoffa. After this scene, we see 2 FBI agents come and try to talk to Frank and get him to confess anything about Hoffa. He tries to redirect them to his lawyer, but they inform him that his attorney is dead.
Who's dead?
Your attorney, Mr. Regano.
He's dead?
Yeah.
Who did it?
Cancer.
This is a great small moment that really cements this part of the movie for me. Now his biggest adversary isn't mobsters and hitmen, but his age and disease. As a matter of fact, everyone that Frank used to know back in the day is dead. They are all gone.
Russell, Angelo, Salerno, Pro, Dorfman, Sally Bugs, they're gone. Who are you protecting?
If he remained silent because he was protecting someone, there's no one left to protect. And yet he still refuses to make any confession to these men. We then cut to Frank sitting in a church where a priest is leading him in prayer. Before he died, Russell said he was going to church and that Frank would see one day. And now Frank is here, nearing the end of his life and seeking absolution from his sins.
That wasn't too bad. It's been a while.
Not bad at all.
And the attention was there, the attention.
I know.
And fun fact, the actor who plays the priest, Jonathan Morris, actually did used to be a priest in the Catholic Church. He asks Frank if he feels any guilt at this point for the things that he's done, to which Frank says that, maybe just the action of showing up to this church is him reaching out of guilt, but in terms of emotion, he doesn't feel anything.
Water under the dam.
The priest asks if he feels remorse for the families that he hurt, and Frank simply responds saying, "I didn't know any of the families except for one." In turn, the priest speculates that it may be possible to be sorry without actually feeling it. Maybe it doesn't just have to be an emotion, but can also be a conviction or a decision of the will to be sorry. Frank says nothing for a moment, but then mutters quietly to himself.
What kind of a man makes a phone call like that? Joe.
Of all the sins he's committed in his life, the one that still haunts him is murdering his best friend and then telling Jimmy's wife that it was gonna be okay. He acknowledges that he is truly the lowest of the low. What kind of man would do that? Certainly not a good man. Consumed by this feeling of guilt, the priest and Frank pray one more time. And in the nursing home, a nurse comes in to check on Frank, who is looking at old pictures of himself, his kids, and of course, Russell and Jimmy. And he shows these pictures to the nurse. Even though his entire family has left him, he's still proud of them.
That's my daughter, Peggy.
Is it?
Yeah.
I don't think I've met her yet.
Oh, she ain't been around too much.
She asks who the man in the photo with Peggy is. Like many people her age, she has no clue who Jimmy Hoffa used to be.
Still alive?
Yes, you are.
That's good to know.
And there's this great shot after this whole scene where we follow the nurse outside of his room and down the hallway, and then the camera slowly turns around and it's suddenly nighttime. And Scorsese has said regarding this transition that a lot of time has passed in between that scene with the nurse and the scene we are about to see. The priest is in the room with Frank, again praying for absolution for his sins. And then he tells Frank that he will visit him again after Christmas. Frank, having no connections to the outside world and no family or friends left, didn't even realize that it was Christmas.
It's Christmas?
Almost.
I ain't going nowhere.
And as the priest leaves, Frank asks him not to close the door all the way, but to leave it open just a little bit.
Father?
Yep.
Do me a favor. Don't shut the door all the way. I don't like that. Just leave it open a little bit.
This is the same practice that Jimmy Hoffa had in his life. Either out of paranoia that someone will still come for him, or out of reverence for his friend who he killed, Frank has adopted this custom of leaving the door open. And so we see Frank from outside, the door mostly closed, on his story. For all the power and money he had in life, he now sits in a nursing home in a small brick room, abandoned by his family and left behind by all of the thieves and murderers he considered his friends. The priest would never see Frank again, because on December 14th of 2003, Frank Sheeran would die. And that is the story and the conclusion of The Irishman. This movie is massive in terms of its runtime, its timeline, and the sheer number of things that this movie could be interpreted to be about. It's about friendship, family, history, death, betrayal, guilt. It is the story of America, but shown through the lens of organized crime. And just in that alone, there is so much you can unpack. It's about Frank's friendship with Jimmy, which ultimately culminates in the betrayal of that friendship. Specifically, betrayal for reasons that Frank himself does not fully understand, and the consequences that it has on his soul. The scope of this film is truly massive. It shows Frank participating in events that shaped the course of the history of the United States, and yet Frank himself feels very passive in his response to it. As Roger Ebert said regarding this film, it's mostly about age, loss, sin, regret, and how you can feel like a passive object, swept along by history even if you played a role in shaping it. If Sheeran's account of his life is to be trusted, and many crime historians warn that it isn't, he was intimately involved in a handful of pivotal moments in American history, and yet we might still come away from The Irishman seeing him as a passive figure, the Zelig or Forrest Gump of gangsters, because of how he tells the story, as if he's in denial about what it meant and what it says about him. In the film, his actions had a tremendous effect on the future of the United States, but he chooses not to see it that way because it will force him to confront the one thing that he doesn't want to, and that is himself. He lived in the denial of just following orders, not realizing that he was selling huge chunks of his soul every time. And so the film remains massive in its scope until Frank gets out of prison, when it narrows in on him like a spotlight. He has no more excuses and no more people around him. His entire life and all of his sins are put on full display. The film deals with a massive ensemble of characters, but in the end, there is only one standing. This film is a confession, the last will and testament of a man with unlimited regret. And there is also excellent use of foreshadowing in this film. All the way at the beginning of the film, when we first saw Frank in the nursing home, we saw a brief shot of a gun being leveled at someone and a bullet passing through their head. This was the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, which we were shown right at the beginning of the film. Even just from that first clip, you already know where this movie is gonna end. In Frank's first conversation with Russell, he talks about his time in the war and how he killed German POWs.
But I never understood how they would just keep digging their own graves.
And now at the end of the film, I believe that he understands, because now he realizes that he was digging his own grave for decades. Every decision, action, and murder he committed brought him one step closer to where he is at the end of the film, where the grave has been dug, and all that he can do now is lay down in it. And finally, we have the dialogue about the fish just before Hoffa died. The fish is representative of the murder of Hoffa himself, and the smell is the guilt that was resultant from that. Frank sits in the filth of the back seat, taking the position of the murderer. Chucky had no idea what kind of fish it was or where it came from. He only knew that he was to pick it up and drop it off. Just like how in the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, he only knew that he was going to pick Jimmy up, drop him off at the house, and had no idea that this was when he would disappear. Sally Bugs wanted all the information on the fish that he could get in case someone questioned him about it. This is representative of his involvement in the crime and how he wanted details regarding it so that if he was ever brought in for questioning, he could know what to say. And Hoffa warns Chucky never to put a fish in his car because you'll never get the smell out. This is representative of Frank's guilt over the murder and how he will never be free from it. This film is a confession by Frank about his sins, and the seeds of that confession are sown all throughout the movie. Now, one big question that needs to be asked coming out of this film is how much of the events of The Irishman are real, or how much of this information can be trusted. The first thing that I will say is that all of the events of the film are taken from the book I Heard You Paint Houses by Charles Brandt, who wrote it after talking face to face with Frank Sheeran. This book, and by extension the film The Irishman, is the confession of Frank Sheeran. But how much of this confession can be trusted? Many aspects of this confession have been disputed both by crime historians and even by ex-mobsters.
But Sheeran did not kill Jimmy Hoffa. And that whole thing, he's been disproved, so often by law enforcement and everybody else.
It is unknown whether he was the one to kill Joe Gallo, and it is certainly disputed whether he killed Jimmy Hoffa. Even just thinking about it, would it be realistic to catch a plane to Detroit just to go kill Jimmy, fly back, and then drive back to Detroit? I love the complex and tragic story of The Irishman so much. But I believe that the real-life story of Frank Sheeran is a little more simple than that. I believe that Frank was loyal to his mafia friends even to his death. He made a confession to Charles Brandt about killing Jimmy Hoffa in the hopes that people would stop looking and just accept his story as the truth. I think he hoped to take the fall so that whoever really committed the murder would get away with it. But I do believe that most of his confession is true, particularly his recollections of his own life and his relationship with Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa. And he may have even been the one to kill Joe Gallo. Other events regarding his involvement with arming Cuban rebels or the role the mafia plays in the JFK assassination are a lot harder to verify or believe. There are many elements of Frank's story that will remain a mystery, and it is likely that those answers died with him. To some people, this may invalidate the emotions and the themes of this film, but I do believe that The Irishman stands on its own. It's not about Frank's mortality and guilt. That is only the tapestry. And the purpose of that tapestry is to cause us to look inward and examine our own lives and our own guilt. It's not a condemnation, but rather an opportunity to sit there and reflect. Many Scorsese movies do something similar, like his film Silence, which I may talk about on this channel at some point. In seeing a man come to the end of his life full of regrets, no matter what those regrets are, it causes us to look inwards at our own lives. It makes us question the way that we live our lives, which I think is very important. There is a lot of guilt to go around in this movie, and the foil to the guilt in this movie is conscience, which is symbolized in the character of Peggy Sheeran. She is a very silent role in The Irishman, which is a very deliberate choice by Scorsese. He has worked with Anna Paquin in the past and was blown away by her ability to communicate emotions non-verbally. Adult Peggy only has one line in the film, and it is a challenge to her father's conscience.
Why?
Scorsese himself had this to say: "There's something you can't talk about? She knows it. She knows who he is, and he knows that she knows." Even when she's sitting there and police are talking about Joey Gallo being murdered, and the anchor said a lone gunman walked in, and you see that she is looking right at him. Aside from the 2 German prisoners in the flashback to World War II, we see Frank murder 4 people in this film. And after each of those times, we get an immediate scene of Frank with Peggy. In a literal way, her role in the movie is the daughter of this mob enforcer, but in a metaphorical way, she is the moral conscience of Frank. A figure who casts judgment on Frank and his actions, and when his conscience reaches the point of no return in killing Hoffa, his conscience deserts him.
My daughter, Peggy, disappeared from my life that day.
This is the ultimate American tragedy. A man who thought he had everything in life until he reached the end of his life and realized he had spent all that time digging a grave for himself. It can't even be considered a fall from grace because the grace was an illusion. Frank joined the mob to make money and as a result became friends with Russell. He had no idea, for better or for worse, the depths that this would lead to. He met Jimmy Hoffa on an assignment and they became closest of friends. But because of his relationship with Russell, when all of Hoffa's mafia connections soured, it was Frank who was sent to deal with him. All his choices lead him to where he is at the end of the film, desperately clinging on to the past. And all he has left are the watch and the ring, two gifts from the only two real friends he had in his life. The man who made him strong and the man that he betrayed. And this is the heartbreaking story of The Irishman. Martin Scorsese is one of my favorite directors, and this is, in my opinion, the best movie I have ever seen by him. I still haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon. This is also, in my opinion, the greatest mafia movie of all time. I believe it is the culmination of the genre. And that's why I wanted to talk about it today, and so if you've stuck around this long, then thank you so much for watching this whole video. This film, The Irishman, is also in my top favorite films of all time, a list which I will probably have to talk about at some point on this channel. I loved this movie so much that not only did I get the Criterion Blu-ray for The Irishman, but I also got the book I Heard You Paint Houses because I just loved this story so much. And in channel news, we just recently passed 3,000 subs, which is amazing. Thank you all so much for continuing to subscribe and continuing to support these videos, and just, I don't know, it means the world. And of course, a huge shout out goes to my patrons, Sean, and my top tier patrons, RD and Snowy, and to user Happy the Knife, who became a member after I did the initial recording. Thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoy your stay here on the Patreon. Thank you all so much for continuing to support me and support the content and my dream of being able to do this for you all full time. And sorry that this upload took a while. If you can see by the timestamp, this was a big project to both write, shoot, edit. This is a big one. So thank you for your patience, and I hope that this was worth the wait. And I also now have a job back home, so if videos are less frequent now, just know that I'm always working on videos in the background, but now I'm balancing that with an actual job that I need to do. I hope that it won't affect my upload schedule, but uploads may get a little less frequent. But just know that I have no plans of stopping. I will always continue to share these stories and to make videos for you all. So with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time for another great video. I hope that you're excited for that because I know that I am. And cut.